remember that not everything that counts can be counted. So there's going to be some non-evidence-based stuff in this presentation. So atherosclerosis is not a new disease. It's an ancient disease. Here we see a monograph in the Egyptian tombs of a heart of the deceased, which is weighed against the feather of Maat. She's the goddess of truth and justice. The horror study that looked at CTs of mummies showed that 38% of Egyptian mummies had coronary atherosclerosis. And this was also true in the situation of mummies from Peru and American Southwest and remote Aleutian Islands. And these people were hunter-gatherers, so they do not have the modern risk factors that we talk about. Ischemic heart disease was known in ancient Egypt. This is from papyrus from 3000 BC, where they talk about illness of the heart and pains in the arm and in the breast, and something that enters the mouth, and it is death that threatens him. So even princesses don't escape coronary artery disease. This is the CT volume rendered image of a princess who was 40 or 45 years old, from who was a member of the royal household in circa BC 1580 to 1550, so more than 3,000 years ago. There are heavy calcification in the right and left coronary arteries. So Leonardo da Vinci described atherosclerosis initially. He described it as vessels in the elderly restrict the transit of blood through thickening of the tunics. Although he had been an anatomist, from he was 50s, when he turned 50s, he became very particularly interested in the heart, and there's a lot of information and artwork that he's done on the heart. Now let me talk a little bit about emotions and angina. It was as early as in 18th century that emotions were connected with angina. John Hunter, who was a Scottish surgeon, he suffered from angina pectoris. In fact, he actually had collapsed after a dispute with a colleague and died, and he did have marked atheroma on his autopsy. This is a story that probably some of you might remember or know, Laila and Majnu. It's an Arab love story. Majnu was in love with Laila, but was denied her hand by Laila's father. He died immediately after writing a poem to his beloved Laila saying, "My heart is firmly seized by a bird's claws. My heart is tightly squeezed when Laila's name flows. My body is tightly bound. My body is tightly bound, is like a finger ring around." The Arab cardiologist, Dr. Hazar, he claims that this was the first clear description of angina in the history of medicine, and that Majnu died of coronary artery disease and a myocardial infarction. Now, coming to South Asians, we know that we're approximately 25% of the world population, yet account for 60% of world's heart disease patients. The UK Biobank study has demonstrated that people of South Asian ancestry experienced twofold higher MACE events compared to the European ancestry, even though their ASCVD risk score was nearly identical. And some of it is attributed to the thrifty gene hypothesis. Again, it's a controversial theory, but may have some evolutionary basis. The idea is that a genetic predisposition to develop diabetes was adaptive for the feast and famine cycles of human existence, perhaps that was more relevant in the Indian subcontinent, therefore allowing humans to fatten rapidly and profoundly during times of feast in order that they might survive during times of famine. However, this would not be advantageous in the current environment. Also, there is a predisposition to low lean mass and central obesity in South Asians. There may be a genetic predispositions to it. So are South Asians genetically susceptible to atherosclerosis? It turns out that there may be. I know there was a very wonderful talk on this yesterday. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it to it. But there certainly seems to be a genetic predisposition in South Asians to coronary artery disease. What about inflammation? Inflammation might have been an evolutionary advantage in the past, as you can see in most of these mummies. And the thought process is that they were exposed to significant infectious processes, and the ones that were survived were selected for genes that provided a robust and effective inflammatory response. However, the same genes can have the opposite effect on survival during later life by promoting acceleration of atherosclerosis. And we see that increased atherosclerosis also in chronic inflammatory conditions like SLE, psoriasis, and rheumatoid arthritis. So, arterial degeneration begins very early in postnatal life. In fact, up to 45% of infants who had autopsy show aortic foam cells. It is what we have is a dial. The environment of our life and the risk factors can either speed up or slow down the extent or the progression of atherosclerosis. What happens when the environment changes rather suddenly, like in case of immigrant populations like myself, who've moved to the United States? And there is a study, large cohort of patients that the Masala study has been looking at and has provided significant insights into this patient population. And in fact, actually has raised the awareness that there is different risk factors and risk profiles that need to be addressed. Again, the genetics are different. The culture is also, again, there's increased prioritization on academics, family duties, significantly less exercise, lifestyle. Again, as we talked about the thrifty gene theory and the diet, the diet has, as everybody knows, we are living a sedentary life, but the diet is still highly carbohydrate and processed foods. All of this can increase visceral obesity, particularly in Asian populations. And one thing that the Masala study also highlighted was even though South Asians were not much of smokers, and their alcohol consumptions were significantly less than their white, black, or Latino counterparts, their exercise time was significantly lower, despite being a well-educated and highly wealthy population. The exercise seems to be low in the population. What about stress? We're living in a constant stress mode, and stress has a lasting effect. And this actually, a great example is the influenza pandemic, during which time there was a frightening acute mortality killing 500 million people worldwide. That was 100 years ago. There were 34 more deaths than they attributed to the First World War itself. Importantly, the epidemic left a mark on the children exposed during gestation, who remarkably had more heart disease 60 years later. Something to watch out for. Let me turn my attention to autonomic nervous system here. What did the ancient Indians know about it? And I think this is relevant. Now, some of you, most of you would know about Ayurveda. Ayurveda is the science of longevity. It's a knowledge of longevity or science of longevity, and talks about the balance of physical, mental, intellectual, and spiritual health. Now, that's very similar to the WHO definition of health. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. These are things that are fascinating to me, and this is from the yogic knowledge, and there is a channel. It's called the Pingala. It terminates. It symbolizes the right-sided sympathetic nervous system, and it gives us a sense of individualism and self as distinct from others. It's the ego area. The left-sided sympathetic nervous system, or the moon channel, it's called, is the Ida, or the comfort channel. It terminates in the superego, and it's the storehouse of all the memories, habits, conditioning, fear, pain, emotions, and expression of feelings. And the central channel is called the Sushumna Nadi, which is the parasympathetic nervous system, and it expresses the power of awareness. And also described are several energetic centers, or the chakras, which I think most of us are becoming increasingly aware of. Here, I'd like to highlight the Anahata chakra, or the one that is correlated with the cardiac plexus on the basis of its location. It means unhurt or unstuck. And the qualities it represents are bliss, peace, harmony, love, and compassion. So we know that the sympathetic nervous system represents the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic rest and digest response. And they need to be in balance. However, when they are not in balance, increased sympathetic activity, as we see in chronic stress modes, and reduced parasympathetic activity has been implicated in the autonomic imbalance, arrhythmias, vascular damage, myocardial damage. We know that hyperactive sympathetic nervous system can cause coronary artery spasm, and also has a significant role in Takotsubo syndrome, or the broken heart syndrome that we not infrequently encounter in our practices. So more recently, there has been focus and emphasis and really bringing out the awareness of spirituality in cardiovascular medicine. Our good friend Kavita and Chinayan and Ankur Kalra have recently written 2 articles published in the European Heart Journal about spirituality in cardiovascular medicine. Spiritual practices can influence various aspects of cardiovascular outcomes. They can affect the major adverse cardiac events and arrhythmia burden, all-cause mortality, risk factor, and also influence the risk factor modification. The one that has been heavily studied is the transcendental meditation, which has showed that there's 48% lower rate of major adverse cardiac events in those patients who meditated. Similarly, the carotid intimal medial thickness was significantly lower in those patients who practiced TM meditation. American Heart Association endorses it and recommends it for reducing lower blood pressure. However, one has to remember that all meditative practices are not equal. Some of them cause actually increased sympathetic activity, and this was highlighted by Dr. Chinayan in the recent paper, and some of them are more geared towards relaxation practices. Now, this was a study that was showed yesterday that despite having higher polygenic risk factor, ideal behavior and cardiovascular health can trump bad genes. And that means patients, in spite of having bad genetic risk, if they practice the ideal lifestyle practices recommended by American Heart Association, had about 4.5 to 20 more heart disease-free years than individuals with risk factors but low health behaviors. So risk modification is an important feature. Counseling should ideally result in change in behavior. Here, this person is saying, eat less and exercise more. That's the most ridiculous fad diet I've heard of. It's not easy to change behavior. And meditative practices can change thoughts, changing tendency and behavioral changes. And I won't go deep into this, but there is yogic theories that explain how they can do that. A mindfulness practice such as meditation and yoga can reduce cognitive rigidity, narrowing of perceived option, and can cause less resistance to change in beliefs, habits, and attitudes. Patients are more likely to overcome impulses and override automatic behaviors. They can perhaps change to a more positive attitude. This actually was studied by Dr. Malice Saward in the Happy Heart study, where she used a 4-pronged approach of using exercise, nutrition, psychological stress reduction maneuvers, and smoking cessation to study metabolic syndrome. And clearly, there was significant reduction within 2 years from the prevalence of 63% to 28% of metabolic syndrome. And so were psychological stress factors reduced over the 2-year period. So coronary atherosclerosis is a complex interplay. Besides lifestyle, diet, inflammation, stress, and genetics that we've talked about, epigenetics may also play a role, actually play a role. Now, I want to talk a little bit about epigenetics. This is a field that is extremely interesting and important. While cells in the body inherit the same DNA, they don't use all of it. Instead, they transcribe different regions of their DNA based on their needs and in response to the environment. Epigenetics regulates this process through various means, such as chemical modification to the DNA. These modifications were initially thought to be erased before the DNA was passed to the offspring, but recent evidence suggests that they can be transmitted. In fact, what happens is these are the RNA-based signals that control gene expression. And some of these signals silence the gene, and some of them are protective signals that prevent silencing. And these signals are duking it out as the offspring develop. And what was interesting in a nematode-based study was that when the gene comes from the mother, the protective signal always wins. But when the gene comes from the father, silencing signal always wins. Once the silencing is initiated via the male inheritance, it remains that way forever, or at least considering that way in 300 generations based on a nematode study. In fact, the more recent study on epigenetics suggested that match matters. So the right combination of parents can turn a gene off indefinitely. So there may be regulatory features that evolve to oppose permanently and potentially maladaptive responses to transient change. So it's important. I think we should start seeing things differently. I want to mention that as we're coming towards the end of the session, that there are things that we can learn from the heart itself. The heart has both systole and diastole. In fact, diastole is longer, 60%. So both contraction and relaxation are active processes. And as we know, heart failure can occur even in the presence of preserved ejection fraction when there is abnormal relaxation. relaxation is an important part. So I want to end my session with this poem. Sometimes the heart forgets how to unfold. Give it forest, move your body, find water, breathe. Right, get into the car and just drive. Give it grace to be the soft and wild thing it aches to be again, reopened and alive. So for many of the heart ailments, meditation, breathing, spending time in nature and moving may be the treatment that we should be looking at. And balance and harmony at the end of the day. So thank you.